of this video is to describe the present tense in French. Uh, Now, there are quite a few changes you need to be aware of in terms of the different verbs that are involved. First point, though, is we talk about the present tense, but it's not really limited to events that are happening in the present, right? It's also very, very common to use the present tense to talk about things that are generally true, right? Just as it is in English, right? So I like dogs, j'adore les chiens, right? Now, what about the different endings? Well, in order to know which ending a verb should have in the present tense, you need to know something about the kind of verb it is, the kind of infinitive. And there really are 5 different types we need to talk about. ER verbs, RE verbs, IR verbs, vouloir and pouvoir, and then the irregular verbs. Now let's look at the first group, the ER verbs. So for example, parler, manger. We've listed here the subjects and the different endings that these verbs are going to have in the present tense. And keep in mind that a lot of what I'm going to say here has to do with conventions of written French. In many cases, it doesn't change pronunciation. So these first 3 here, parle, 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 and even down here, parle, the pronunciation's identical. It's just that when you write, there are some different endings. So make sure you learn the sequence for the ER verbs. RE verbs look a little different. Right? First thing you'll notice is that unlike in the ER verbs, now we see the S for the je person. Right? So have a look at these because they're not the same. Right? The IR verbs follow a pattern very similar to the RE verbs, where it's SS, and here it's always going to be T. Now, vouloir and pouvoir stand apart because they do have an X for the je form and the tu form. But here again, we have the T for the il, elle, third person. Now, there's a big category of frequent irregular verbs you need to be familiar with, because these are the ones that don't follow the general patterns described above, and they tend to be the most frequent verbs. These are the ones that are resistant to being part of the normal pattern. Right? So you really need to learn these individually, and I've given you some of the most common ones: être, avoir, faire, and aller. Right? So make sure you learn these different patterns for the different grammatical subjects. Savoir as well. Right? So let's look at some questions you need to pay attention to. Right? It's very common for people to associate this S with a je, but remember, that's not the case with ER verbs. It's only the tu form, if it's an ER verb, that's going to have an S. Right? So make sure you or your students are able to go through all these errors, which are very common, and know why it's a problem and why it should be the form that's in blue here. Right? And we give you the explanations, the answers to the question below. Right? So be aware of the current mistakes, and you have quite a few questions to consider in this section, and lots of mistakes to avoid. At the bottom, I should point out that for any verb on the Bon Patron grammar site, you simply enter the infinitive, and just like a Becherel, you have all the forms you're going to need. Right? In the present here, but all the other verb tenses are also going to be represented. All right, to make sure you understand these 5 different categories of present tense endings, we've given you quite a few interactive exercises. Simply write the answer. Does that look good? Well, we'll check. No, try again. And that's because this is an ER verb, and we know that for ER verbs it has to be E only for the je, not S. Right? So make sure you do all these exercises. There are quite a few. And you can Also, if you want to, like, everything here has been taken from the free French grammar guide from Bon Patron that you'll find here. You can always go over to Bon Patron and write some sentences in the present to see whether the grammar checker finds it acceptable. So good luck. I know it's a lot of information. So take your time and go through the explanations, the questions about, and the exercises to make sure you're using this form correctly.